Hi, it's Mat McLachlan with a special invitation. If you'd like to join me and my team of outstanding historians to walk the ground where these videos were made, visit our website and join one of our battlefield tours. That's battlefields.com.au. Enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to a special episode of Living History. Whether you're joining us on the podcast or via YouTube, thank you for tuning in because it's a special week. It's Remembrance Day this week, the anniversary of an important day of commemoration. And I wanted to talk a little bit about it and why it's important, where it came from, the significance today of Remembrance Day. And joining me to do that is someone who's been on the show a lot. We're going to see a lot more of him in the future. It's Karl James from the Australian War Memorial. Karl, thanks for joining us on this special commemorative episode.
G'day, Matt. Thanks for having me back again.
Now, mate, we're going to talk a little bit about Remembrance Day. Well, not a little bit. We're going to talk a lot about Remembrance Day. And particularly, I wanted to discuss the significance of it to particularly Australians in 2024 and if it is still relevant and the way we commemorate it. But I thought what I might kick off and do is do a little bit of a historic background on Remembrance Day. So I'll give a little bit of an overview for anyone who hasn't, who doesn't quite understand the origins. But Karl, feel free to contribute here if you think I'm missing anything out. But it's the day that commemorates the end of the First World War. So it's very closely tied to the First World War. And on the 11th of November 1918 at 11 a.m., famously the guns fell silent and ended the First World War. And that was because an armistice had been signed in the early hours of that morning, which ended fighting on the First World War. So the German army effectively surrendered. The First World War came to an end. And then a year later at Versailles, the treaty that finalised the First World War was put into effect. But we remember this moment, this day of the 11th of November, and that moment precisely 11 a.m., just a convenient time, I think, for history. But of course, Remembrance Day has expanded since then and now doesn't just apply to the First World War. It now applies to all conflicts Australians have served in. And indeed, it's commemorated around the world as a day of commemoration and remembrance. Is that, in your opinion, a fair estimation of where we've come from with the history of Remembrance Day?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. It's a very good overview. And I think the interesting thing with the day, or Armistice Day as it was known back in the day, and from Australia, it's interesting because we do have these two major anniversary events on our calendar. Obviously, we have Anzac Day in April, and then we have Remembrance Day in November. And so it's we're a little bit unusual, I think, because unlike, say, places such as the UK or the United States, where there's one day of national reflection and commemoration, in Australia we have two. And oddly, almost, Anzac Day is the original. It's the OG day of commemoration. The first Anzac Day was observed in 1916, whereas the very first Armistice Day was observed or marked in 1919. So it's I won't say it's a poor cousin, but certainly it's very much always a little bit secondary, which is why I think in the Australian context, it has a little bit of an unknown element to it. It's never as in your face or as foremost in your front and centre in your mind as, say, Anzac Day.
Well, it's not even a public holiday as it is, around the world. That's almost unique in Australia that Remembrance Day is not commemorated as a public holiday. So I think there's a fair reflection there in the importance of Anzac Day compared to Remembrance Day. But let's take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the origins of the day and how it's evolved, not so much from a history point of view, but more from a societal point of view, because I think it's interesting that Anzac Day, I think, was always very much about veterans. From the moment that Anzac Day kicked off, I think it was all about veterans. And I've heard family members talk about in the interwar years, how they always didn't enjoy Anzac Day because it was a day that their dad went off and hung out with his mates and had a few too many beers and came home a bit morose and angry. And that there was a feeling that Anzac Day was actually quite excluding to families and to relatives, and particularly to bereaved families too, that there wasn't a place for them on Anzac Day. Anzac Day was about mates getting together and talking about the old times. But I think Remembrance Day has been interesting because it's always seemed to me that front and centre of Remembrance Day commemorations, it sort of was twofold. It was this concept of commemorating a great victory. And of course, the First World War was horrific. And so there was a lot to commemorate when it finally came to an end. But also, it seemed to me that looking at historic accounts of Remembrance Day, that families, and particularly bereaved families, were very much a focal point of that. So it was also a day that had a dual purpose of commemorating the victory, but also remembering the dead. Is that a way you see Remembrance Day looking back historically?
Oh, absolutely. And you can see this in the contemporary newspaper reports, in the photographs from the ceremonies that took place around the country, say in Sydney and Melbourne, for example. What is interesting is that Anzac Day has always had that bit of a split personality. Like, what is it? Who is it for? And what are the rites and traditions of Anzac Day? And so, as I mentioned earlier, the first Anzac Day ceremony took place in 1916, but it does have that split personality. So, you have the solemn, somber occasion of the dawn service, the Reveille, the prayers, the ode, very much that mindful reflection. And yes, historically, it was very much exclusive. This is for the returned men to remember their mates and to acknowledge their service and sacrifice. You then had the march, typically a veterans march, and then afterwards, say mid morning, is down to the boozer for two up and lots of beers. So it was very much this exclusive type of a day and event. And also, to the throw into the mix, you had sometimes sports carnivals, mass prayer services. It was really, racing events, going to the footy on Anzac Day. It's a more almost like a festival in some ways, and historically was rather exclusive and focused on the returned men. Whereas, say, with Remembrance Day, because it came about specifically in 1919, firstly to mark the end of the Great War, but also as to pause and reflect on what that war cost the Commonwealth, it was much more somber, much more focused, and it didn't really evolve and change in the same way that Anzac Day has over the years. So by 1919, all the traditions and rituals of Anzac Day within Australia had already been established or in the process of being established. There's a lot of argy-bargy as to what it would be, who owned it and who was it for. But whereas with the Remembrance Day of 1919 and 1920 still looks very similar to the Remembrance Day of 2024. That said, to correct myself, it was Armistice Day back in the day, but it was very much to mark the armistice of the end of the Great War and to reflect on the Commonwealth's war dead. And from the Australian perspective, that was those 62,000 Australians who died in Gallipoli, Sinai, Palestine, and the Western Front. So you was very much pause, think about the cost, pause for 2 minutes, and then move on with your life.
I think it's an important point to make that these days are not carved in stone. Society is always evolving and the days are evolving along with them. And I don't think we actually probably realise most of it, how much Anzac Day has changed from where it was in 1930, for example, or in 1955. Anzac Day has come a very long way and is a lot more inclusive now. Us, as just members of the public going down, participating in marches quite often, wearing our relatives' medals, even if we've never served. Then us going down to the pub and having a beer and a game of two up. It was never like that. Those institutions were always in place, but they were in place, as you said, only for the veterans, and the rest of us were merely spectators. We had our opportunity to go down and wave a flag and pay our respects, but the general public, it seemed to me, wasn't particularly heavily involved in those official elements of Anzac Day. But it also struck me that Anzac Day was a bit like the rough and tumble cousin to Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day was the solemn official day when the government officials would come out and very structured and celebrated in a very similar way around the world. Whereas Anzac Day was this bit more of a rough and tumble day for the boys to get together and tell the old stories. Is that a fair call?
Oh, absolutely, Matt. It doesn't Armistice Day or Remembrance Day. It's won't necessarily say it's locked in concrete or locked in sandstone, but it's very much formed. You have so the first one was marked in 1919, and that included prayers, speeches, laying of wreaths. In 1920, particularly in the UK, it changed a little bit because they had the Entomb of the Unknown Warrior in Westminster Abbey, and so that unknown soldier represented all of the Commonwealth's war dead. And so that gave a real focus to the efforts and commemorative activities around Armistice Day in 1920. And I think, too, it also helped create that feel of why it's so somber, why it's so formal. It's almost like a funeral in the 1920, and that continued into the years to come. So in 1921, that's when, particularly in the UK, you start to see people wearing poppies, partly to raise funds for the British Royal Legion, but also to acknowledge, again, the war dead. And those traditions are spread right across the Commonwealth. And the biggest difference too when we think about Anzac Day and say Remembrance Day or Armistice Day, later on Remembrance Day, is that Anzac Day is very much the Australian and New Zealand national stories and national days of commemoration, whereas Armistice Day and Remembrance Day was marked right across the Commonwealth, as well as in the United States where it became Veterans Day and elsewhere. So it's much more of an international event, but it's still seen to be very heavily locked into that commemoration and reflection on the First World War. So it does change, but it's very, very subtle. And it's really not until the end of and the other biggest change too was following the end of the Second World War, that's when the name changed from Armistice Day to Remembrance Day.
Well, of course, little did they know when they were commemorating Armistice Day and all the people that have died during the First World War that they're only 20 years away from doing it all again. So, as we said, these things evolve. A couple of things I wanted to touch on there that you mentioned, Karl, which I think are really fascinating, is that firstly, briefly, the idea of the poppy and the idea that the poppy grew in the broken ground of the Western Front and so was a symbol to the soldiers. I think from the earliest days, the poppy became a very logical symbol of remembrance and still is to this day. But I've noticed that there's a difference the way the poppy is viewed in the UK, for example, to how it's viewed in Australia. I think in Australia it's viewed as a good symbol of remembrance, that people recognise as something to do with Remembrance Day, and but in the UK it is the Remembrance poppy. It is really a very strong symbol of remembrance. And I know that, for example, my tour company, we have our part of our logo is a representation of a poppy, simply to have that feeling of remembrance and an association with the First World War. And I've had a number of UK people say to me, I'm not sure it's appropriate to be using the hallowed Remembrance poppy as a commercial emblem. So it's fascinating, even the distinction of those small elements of the day, how they can mean different things to different nations.
Oh, absolutely. And it's very much the red poppy in the British Commonwealth experience, which we have in Australia. And so that was introduced in the Armistice Day ceremonies in 1921. And that actually was a tradition that went across to Anzac Day. And that's partly why we wear poppies on Anzac Day, so the connection of those two. But it is a really interesting debate and discussion, particularly places in, say, the UK, where rather than it being on the 11th, you have that Remembrance Day Sunday. And it's been commented to, say, in the last 10 or 15 years or so, that the red poppy is also very much tied to almost like a British national identity. And really, if we were doing this podcast in the UK, we should be wearing our poppies almost for that fortnight leading up to Remembrance Day. So it's almost like a little bit of a commemorative
It's like Christmas decorations, isn't it, mate? That they come out earlier and earlier and earlier in the shops. It's the same with the poppy. And it's a funny thing that if you're a newsreader or a politician or anyone who's interested in demonstrating that you wave the British flag in the UK, you've got to be wearing that poppy. As you say, we'd be raked over the coals for not wearing one today. Having said that, I think we're doing our bit for Remembrance Day. I don't think the symbol of the poppy is going to make or break the story. But if you're a politician or a news reader or some public figure, you've got to wear that poppy around Remembrance Day. And as you say, it's occurring earlier and earlier. It's like basically the whole month of November, you have to be wearing that poppy to just demonstrate that not only do you care about Remembrance Day, but you've been thinking about it in advance, and you're a good Brit. So it's a fascinating aspect that these small little symbols can come to mean so much tied around these special days.
Yeah, and then I guess our parallel would be in around Anzac Day is the way people are draping themselves with the Australian flag as if it's a cape. So the sense and notions of nationalism and national identity is still there. They just represent themselves in different ways, whether that be the red poppy in the UK or an Australian flag or a Southern Cross tattoo.
Oh.
For our Australian Anzac Day
everyone get out their
spirits.
Southern Cross tattoos on Anzac Day.
And then I just realised we're recording visually, so you would have seen my eye roll.
We'll move on from that one. One thing I've noticed about Anzac Day, mate, is in terms of history, it's been cyclical, the interest in Anzac Day. I mean, we think now, because since probably the 90s, Anzac Day has been so important in Australia that we have this feeling that Anzac Day was always extremely important. But I know from the historic record that it sort of ebbed and flowed, the public connection with Anzac Day, and particularly during, for example, the Vietnam War. Anzac Day was not a popular thing to be commemorated. Do you know, in your experience, you might not know the answer to this, but do you feel that Remembrance Day has ebbed and flowed the same way Anzac Day has?
I don't really think it has. And see, the advantage or the strength and longevity of Anzac Day has been its ability to change and evolve over the decades. It's no longer necessarily owned by one group or one or small section of groups. Modern day Anzac Day commemorations have almost celebrate First Nations service, women, children, families as much more of an intergenerational experience. And it has become very closely aligned with Australian or perceptions of Australian values. So it's changed and evolved from what it looks like it was in, say, the 1960s and 1970s. With Remembrance Day, though, it hasn't really changed and evolved as much, and it hasn't really changed and evolved as much, and it's also much more subtle. So some of the variations were in 1993 when the unknown Australian soldier was brought from France and interned in the Australian War Memorial to represent Australia's missing and Australia's war dead. So that was a change in that previously our focus commemoration was on the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, which represented all of the Commonwealth's war dead. In 1993, we bring the unknown Australian soldier to here. Gives it again a renewed sense of the Remembrance Day connection with the First World War. And at that time, there were still First World War veterans and still First World War widows amongst the Australian community. So it locked Remembrance Day into that First World War commemorative piece. But then in 1997, that's when it officially changed to commemorate and reflect all of Australia's service and sacrifice and our war dead. But I think because, and that's also too, when I think the 2-minute silence really dropped down to 1 minute silence, in a lot of formal observances of Remembrance Day. But because it's been so successfully locked or branded to the First World War, it's never really been challenged or I think has been contested as, say, Anzac Day. But I think, too, some people may feel its relevance is also may shift or evolve or diminish in the years to come as the First World War gets further and further away into the past. So even though technically Remembrance Day reflects all of Australia's war dead and sacrificed in wars and conflicts, it's still very much overshadowed by Anzac Day.
Yeah, it's a great point you make too. I think that Remembrance Day potentially hasn't evolved and hasn't changed as much, and the perspective of people towards Remembrance Day hasn't changed as much simply because the day doesn't mean as much to them. People, it's not a public holiday. People, apart from, a small minority of people remembering to pause at 11 a.m. And, I just don't think people are that heavily engaged with the day. So therefore it's almost free to stay locked in that little time capsule. You mentioned the War Memorial, and obviously you're head of history there at the War Memorial and have been for quite a while now, I believe. It's been a few years now you've been at the War Memorial.
Yeah.
What's your view on the significance of Remembrance Day to the Australian War Memorial? The Australian War Memorial is the keeper of our memories, of our commemoration, of our stories and connection with veterans. Talk to me a little bit about the significance of Remembrance Day at the Australian War Memorial.
Well, it is and will likely always remain one of our major activities. It is a form of national commemoration, national reflection. At the moment, the site is a hive of activity. So driving up Anzac Parade this morning on my way to work, the events staff were putting out the plastic chairs, getting ready for Monday. Big marquees are being set up around the pavilion to accommodate VIPs, dignitaries, as well as the media who will broadcast the national commemoration. The order of service has been printed and final proof checked and edited. So that's being ready to be handed out to visitors as they come. And the site looks, as in the memorial grounds, looks spectacular. The grass is green. The stone of remembrance is, I don't know, shining is the right word, but it's very, sparkling. And it's also glowing. A little bit exciting. Yeah, glowing. It's sort of giving off this Anzac spirit vibe. But it's a little bit exciting too, because this is the first Remembrance Day ceremony that will take place on the new parade ground, which only opened earlier this year. So we had Anzac Day on the parade ground, but this is now the first Remembrance Day. So we're starting to get this sense of the newness of what's happening. Also, in terms of just the hive and tempo of work, Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, those two big peak periods, just the normal ebb and flow of working at the memorial. So it's almost like, this is your sales season starting. So if Anzac Day is our Christmas, then our Remembrance Day is our end of the financial year sales.
It's my busy time as well. I always see that as the bookend of my year too. So
because it kind of naturally is that hallmark of where people are thinking and reflecting about, Dad was in the war, Granddad was in the war, what's coming out for Christmas, what books are available for purchase and the like. So there's a kind of a natural rhythm to it. I should also mention too that because Remembrance Day is very much more the international ceremony, has that international focus and flavour, on Sunday evening, the Diplomatic Corps in Canberra will be coming to the memorial and they'll be laying their their wreaths around the pool of reflection in the commemorative space, as well as around the tomb, around the cenotaph itself. So that has that wider, bigger connection. And I think that's the important thing with the Remembrance Day, is that we remember it has that wider, bigger story all across the Commonwealth. On 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, across the Commonwealth, we should all be pausing for 2 minutes. It's not just an Australian story, it's us taking part as bigger international community.
Is that event for Remembrance Day that you're staging this year, is that an invitation event where special people are asked to come, or is it simply members of the public that want to turn up? How is it from a members of the public point of view?
On the day, open to everybody. Pop into the website, request a ticket. The ticket's free. Ticketing's free. It's a ticketed event merely just to help coordinate people and to get a sense of numbers. But it's very much free to everyone to come along.
Well, there'll still be time for people
in the day.
It's great to hear, and there'll still be time for people to attend. When this comes out, there'll still be a few days before Remembrance Day, so that's very exciting. Do you know much about how Remembrance Day has evolved at the Australian War Memorial? I mean, obviously, I assume that in the years, the War Memorial opened during the Second World War. I assume that in the years immediately after that, veterans were a very big focus of the events. Do you know, from a historic perspective, how the Remembrance Day commemorations have changed there?
Well, it's a big part of the history of the organisation itself, because the inauguration stone and the War Memorial here in Canberra, we opened on Remembrance Day 1941. So it has a special place in the organisation's heart, as well as it being a focus for national commemoration and reflection. So it's when we opened the doors, really. The biggest difference in terms of, and that was outside of the War Memorial in public grounds. And then in 1942, it was very much a reduced service, as was Anzac Day in 1942, because of the threat of the Japanese wartime environments and situations and the like. You also had armed soldiers defending the War Memorial during from 42 to 45, members of the local volunteer defence corps, and so you had armed soldiers. So unlike today, where you'd have members of, say, the Federation Guard performing ceremonial duties around the pool of reflection or the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier, putting a catapult party up, during the war, we actually had armed soldiers defending the War Memorial in case the Japanese invaded Canberra. So that's a notable change. And then post Second World War, Anzac Day as well as Remembrance Day, the ceremonies themselves took place within the commemorative space. So when you'd walk up the stairs, you walk past the Menin Gate Lions, move into the pool of reflection. That was where the ceremony took place, because that was largely where that accommodated the numbers, particularly post Second World War into the 50s and 60s. The numbers are very small. And then in more recent times, say post-Vietnam War, that's when the Remembrance Day, like Anzac Day, the ceremony took place on the parade ground in front of the memorial. The program itself looked remarkably similar, and you have hymns, speeches, laying of wreaths. Sometimes the duration has varied, but the only real new amendment in more recent years of the memorial has been we now start the ceremony with the didgeridoo player. So they're a member of the Australian Defence Force. They play the didge, and then you move into the more traditional, familiar elements of Remembrance Day itself. So the ode, prayers, speech, ode, minute silence, laying of wreaths, wrapping up.
Are there any elements of this that you're coordinating with the Imperial War Museum in London, for example, or other institutions around the Commonwealth, or is it very much an Australian experience?
This is very much a Canberra focus too. So it'd be great to do that, but this time around, this is very much just sort of our hood.
Well, talk to me from your perspective, Karl. This doesn't have to be definitive; it's really your opinion, but just about the public's view about Remembrance Day, because you're obviously there every day at the War Memorial. I assume you're speaking to people who are coming and going. Obviously, Anzac Day is the focus, and there'd be much more interest and much more discussion about Anzac Day. But does Remembrance Day come up? Is it something the public is aware of? Is it something they're asking questions about? Is it something that they're keen to find out more about?
In the main, no. And it might surprise you a little bit, because people who are coming sort of Anzac Day, yes, lots of attention, lots of inquiries, lots of media requests, so forth, lots of things doing stuff. Remembrance Day is quiet is not the word, but it doesn't necessarily, while we have a hive of activity with what we're doing to prepare for the ceremony, to prepare the website, to prepare web content and the like, so we're still disseminating the history making people aware of the need to reflect. But almost now it's like, what is remember? You almost have to go back to basics. What is Remembrance Day? Why do we call that? What is it about? Is it the First World War? Is it different to Anzac Day? How is it different? Um, do we have 1 minute or 2 minute silence? Why do we have the minute silence? So it doesn't have the same level of, I guess, awareness. And likewise, you don't receive the same number of public inquiries or media inquiries. The things we do get tend to be more around, what will the ceremony look like? When will it take place? Can I get a ticket? Can I sit down? So it's almost as though it has a very engaged audience, but it's a much smaller audience compared to, say, Anzac Day, or more widely around Australian military history.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it seems to me that the focus on Armistice Day / Remembrance Day, a lot of it, from at least from my work with the media and trying to tell the story, is people really want to know about that last day and those last hours and minutes of fighting on the Western Front, because it's a very human and in many ways, a very tragic tale. The idea that it was announced at something like 5 o'clock in the morning that the guns would fall silent, but they didn't fall silent till 11, which gave ample time for killing to occur. And, we even saw in the recent All Quiet on the Western Front, that new adaptation, the movie, that was a very big deal. The idea that attacks were still being ordered right up until the last minutes of the war. And even though I think that was a bit overdone in that movie, elements of that certainly were true. So I find that the thing that really engages people in the story of Remembrance Day is just thinking about what that meant to be in the front lines in those last minutes of the war. And it really is, when you read some of those accounts, it really is an engaging human story, isn't it?
Well, that's what connects us all with history, particularly the longer you have distance. Why the distance from the events and the lack of physical contact with the veterans? It's the human experience. That's what people are interested in. It is in that sense of, what did they do? What did they endure? And now increasingly too, yes, you can think about, there's always those questions. Who was the last man to die on the Western Front on the 11th of November? And they can identify that person. But as we now know, just because a gun stopped at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November, the dying didn't. How do those men and women return their post service journey? Whether it be back to Australia, surviving the Spanish flu, the Great Influenza, transitioning from the military into civilian life. That sense now looking at, well, how, what were the post-service deaths immediately after the end of the war. The role of the War Memorial's role of honor stops in 1921, because that's when the AIF was disbanded. So you still have people, men and women, dying up until that point as a result of their military service, and they're commemorating the role of honor. But then what about the next 10, 5, 10, 15, 20 years? So there's lots of things you can unpack about this. And in some ways, what makes it new and interesting is thinking now about, well, what was that post-service journey like for those men and women coming back from the First World War, coming back from the Western Front, back to Sydney, Wollongong, Canberra, and think, well, I've been away for 2 or 3 years. The world's entirely changed. How do I transition and just get on with my life, in addition to just having one boozy day on Anzac Day or a morning of silence on Remembrance Day or Armistice Day?
It's a really interesting aspect of our First World War story is, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but those years immediately after the war. And I know that Professor Joan Beaumont wrote a great book called The Broken Years several years ago, trying to tell that story. But I think there's still a lot more stories to be told about literally hundreds of thousands of troops coming back after both world wars, and PTSD that wasn't broadly understood, and rates of suicide that were often covered up, mostly out of respect for the families, and just the horrific, for lots of people, what life was like after the two big world wars. And you mentioned earlier, you touched on it, the idea that perhaps people don't quite understand Remembrance Day and the significance anymore. And I always think there's two aspects to that. It's either because you could look at it from a negative point of view and say, oh, people don't respect the memories of the Anzacs as much as they should. But what I always like to say is the reason that we're losing connection with these specific days is because we haven't had to live through the consequences of them. We're not, it's not the case that if you and I had been born, generations earlier, you and I and everyone we know would have served in the war. Even if we hadn't served in the war, we would have lost our father or our brother, or there would be family members that we lost, or family members who came home broken men. And, it's so Anzac Day and Remembrance Day to those people had an entirely different significance. And I think it's actually probably a good thing that we're losing that connection with that significance, because it's pretty horrific and we haven't had to live through it. So I always like to say that it's good that people need to be reminded of why these days are important and what they actually meant to previous generations.
Oh, absolutely. And they're really good points to consider too for both those days of commemoration. Why are they important? Well, some of the very literal reasons they're important is because like either they themselves served overseas and came back to Australia, and is their brothers, their fathers, their mates, they're killed and they're buried or they disappeared and vaporized on the other side of the world. The families back home in Australia the remains weren't repatriated. They didn't have their father or brother wasn't buried in the local cemetery. The cenotaph in Sydney or the war memorial in a local town, that had to serve as a quasi place of commemoration and reflection for their loved one, which is why you do have, say, Armistice Day and then Remembrance Day. It is somber because that's when people come together. It's physically a point people can travel to, pause, think about their loved one, and so it's a natural point of reflection. So it does have that immediacy. Well, it had that immediacy, which we now today fortunately don't have. And in many ways, too, I think for us just to give up, 1 minute of our time, stop scrolling, just pause for 1 minute, actually turn off, and we now call it mindfulness. But if you just turn off for 1 minute on the 11th of November this year, and we pause and reflect, and that's doing something. We enjoy a very rich, vibrant, and safe society because of what our grandparents and great grandparents served and sacrificed in the First and the Second World War. We've
Yeah,
inherited the peace that they fought for.
I was having this discussion with my 16-year-old son because I took him to the battlefields in September, which was fantastic. So that was a great experience for me to see it all through the eyes of a young person. But he's school captain. He's a very upstanding young bloke, and he said that he finds it quite upsetting that during the minute's silence on Remembrance Day or Anzac Day, he said the kids in my school just don't get it. They giggle and laugh and poke each other, and they find it really hard to stay silent. And he said, I find that I get really angry about that. But then I put that perspective to him. I said, but there's a good angle to it. The reason they don't have any connection with it is these things we just mentioned, that they haven't had to live through the aftermath of a big war. And so in that way, in a philosophical way, the promise of the men who served has been fulfilled, that these young people, a lot of them were fighting so that their future generations wouldn't have to be, a little bit philosophical about it. But I think it's very true. I think in that, and that's an example of it, that their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren now don't quite get it for that very reason.
Yeah, and oddly too, just to take it back to the past and the origins of Armistice Day, so that notion of a minute silence, again, it was created, the first floated in London in 1919. So Edward George Honey, he was actually a Melbourne journalist, so he served in the AOF in the Western Front and was working in London post-war as a journo. He came up with the idea of having a 5-minute silence to reflect on the war dead, to acknowledge the first anniversary of the Armistice Day, of Armistice that was then coming up. He wrote to the paper, put the story in the paper, and then meanwhile, a South African politician, Sir Percy Fitzpatrick, also had the idea of 5-minute silence, because in South Africa they had a tradition after every major action in South Africa, where a lot of South Africans were killed, they paused for 2 minutes in Cape Town. So there's both ideas are floating around about the same time. And originally they were going to do it for 5 minutes. The King liked the idea of this 5 minutes. They then trialled it, but found that 5 minutes was way too long. So then it was.
Can you imagine today get anyone to stand still and do nothing for 5 whole minutes? I mean, exactly. Absolutely no hope. That would be an eternity to most people these days.
Yeah. So in some ways, there's some sympathies, I guess. 110 years later, almost, we're looking back and we can do 1 minute because we acknowledge our forefathers couldn't do 5 minutes.
Well, they settled on 2 for a long time, didn't they? And I think even 2 minutes would be a long time. I note that whenever you go to Anzac Day events or, in Meadow Gate, Last Post or things like that, the minute silence is an appropriate time of silence, and then we're back into it. So it says something
pretty
about
much
short attention spans. We spoke about veterans. What's your perspective on the importance of Remembrance Day to veterans in 2 ways? Both your excellent knowledge of the history of the War Memorial and Remembrance Day. So what did Remembrance Day mean to veterans of the past? But also, what's your perspective on what it means to today's modern veterans?
Very similar, I think, in the terms of it was very much locked into the First World War veterans. So it was important for First World War veterans. They experienced it. This was their piece that they were first to mark, and it was their mates that they were commemorating. My observation, as purely just an observation, has been that it doesn't connect. Remembrance Day doesn't connect with modern and contemporary veterans in the same way. It doesn't connect with the widest Australian society in the same way that Anzac Day does. I think Anzac Day is so dominant. It's so well known. It's so points of connection. It's become such an Australian day. That's always seems to be first and foremost in most people's minds. Whereas it's now more if a member of the ADF or a recent veteran has an ancestor who served in the First World War, it's still Remembrance Day, I think, is always so heavily locked into the First World War. It'll be very hard for it to ever break that mold or to get beyond the brand. And it's still very much Anzac Day remains the focus.
Now I'm going to ask you the big question, mate. I'm going to get you to look into your crystal ball. What's the future of Remembrance Day, in your opinion?
I think that depends on how good a job you and I do in making and reminding listeners and people in Australians why Remembrance Day matters. Why Australian history matters and why what our mothers and grandmothers did and grandfathers did in the First and Second World War and other conflicts, why does it matter? So really it's on us to engage with our public, to engage with the audience, to engage with those people who have those family connections, say, yes, it was a long time ago, but these stories still matter. It's very much a human experience. And these men and women served and died and suffered for the freedoms and liberties that we enjoy today.
Yeah, it's a great point, mate. And I find that as well in my media work. This week and the week before Remembrance Day, I have a number of interviews to do about the story. But we very much have to push it out there. We have to say to media outlets, "Oh, don't forget Remembrance Day is coming up, and I'm free to talk about it if you want to do an interview." And we get a good response. We do a lot of press. I do a lot of interviews to remind people the story. But it's the exact opposite to Anzac Day, where we're getting a lot of approaches from people a long time before Anzac Day. But I kind of don't mind that. I like that we have, through a historic coincidence in this back half of the year, a chance to stop and remember again. I see it as an opportunity that we're very fortunate we have 2 days to commemorate rather than just one. And it's always a good excuse to remind people of the importance of the First World War, but also the ongoing significance and this general concept of remembrance and service and sacrifice. So I'm always a big fan of Remembrance Day. I think we're really lucky to have it late in the year to help continue to push that message. And hey, by doing things like we're doing today, mate, hopefully we're waving the flag and keeping it alive. I know that the work you're doing there at the War Memorial does a huge amount to keep it alive. So I think that's brilliant. And if you're listening to this and going to be in Canberra, definitely go and join that service at the War Memorial and do your bit for continuing this tradition of remembrance. I think it's really important.
It's a really nice occasion to come together as a community, whether you're in Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne, your local hometown, wherever you're listening. Come together as a community. Pause 2 minutes, 3 minutes. It's not a big part of your day, and just pay your respects.
Yeah, very well said, mate. Before you go, it's virtually I don't do an interview without someone asking me if I know what's going on with the development at the Australian War Memorial. So can you give us the quick 30-second update on how the redevelopment is going?
Well, I've already mentioned the parade ground, so that's coming along really quite well. At the moment, we're making plans to move the collection items that were kept off the site at Mitchell back into town here. The new Charles Bean Reading Room will open to the researchers and the public. Will open to researchers early next year, so that's quite exciting. So it's moved from that temporary reading room into a new permanent home. And also, too, we were fortunate enough to have a site walk through the new Anzac Hall exhibition space. So this is the 2-story exhibition space where we'll have 5 new exhibitions on the top level, 4 of them to do with the First and Second World War, and then 1 to do my exhibition on Chinooks in Afghanistan. And then downstairs, we've got the recent conflicts and peacekeeping exhibition space. So now we can actually walk through this. We're imagining we have our design drawings of what the exhibitions will look like, and now kind of marrying them up, thinking about, we think the Chinook goes there. That's where we think the midget submarine is. It looks really close to the wall, looks bigger in the drawings. How's it going to fit? So that's all an element of coming on together quite well. From a curatorial point of view, it's exciting for the Anzac Upper team, or the Anzac, that's the team I'm part of. We've done all the exhibition text. The multimedias have almost been produced, almost finished. The last level design for showcases and the object panels and object layouts, like the design element, 2D design element's almost finished. So it's coming together really quite well. We can kind of see the ends almost inside.
Well, it's very exciting. And a month or so ago, we had a podcast. I can't recently, anyway, some stage in the recent past, we had an episode you and I did where we did a walk around of the items in storage and a good chat to Lockie Grant about the new displays and the new developments of the War Memorial. So it's certainly exciting to see it getting closer to being available to the public. Karl,
I
it's been brilliant,
suggest.
mate. We're going to have you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, look, I suggest coming down in 2026. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, it's going to be great. I'm looking forward to seeing the new developments there at the War Memorial. Mate, thank you for coming on the show. We're going to have you on more often to do episodes like this to talk more about Australian history and what it means in modern times. But it's been really great to get your insights on Remembrance Day. It is a really important day. It's lost a little bit of its significance as time has gone on, but hopefully people listening to this or watching on YouTube will go out and quite literally and metaphorically wave the flag and remind friends and family of why Remembrance Day is so important. So, Karl, thanks so much for joining us to tell this important story.
No worries, man. Thanks for having me. I'll keep coming back until I get some free merch.
It's on its way, mate. It's on its way. Thanks, Karl.
See you, dude.